Venezuela tried to ambush the USS Gerald at Ford, then this happened. Let me take you back to March 12, 2025, a date that, at first glance, seemed like just another routine naval exercise in the Caribbean. The USS Gerald at Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, was conducting what the Pentagon called freedom of navigation operations near the Venezuelan coast. Then, according to U.S. Southern Command, Venezuelan patrol boats suddenly altered course, closing in at high speed in what officials described as an unprofessional and unsafe maneuver. The Ford's escorts responded with warning shots, and the Venezuelans backed off. End of story, right? Not even close. This wasn't just another minor naval incident. It was a deliberate provocation, one that could have spiraled into a full-blown crisis if either side had miscalculated. And here's the part they're not telling: this wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about China, Russia, and the unraveling of American dominance in our own hemisphere. I've spent the last 3 decades studying these kinds of flashpoints, first in the intelligence community, then as a scholar of great power competition, and what I'm about to lay out will challenge everything you think you know about this incident. Because if you believe the official narrative that this was just another case of a rogue regime acting recklessly, you're missing the bigger picture. And that's dangerous. The official what they want you to believe. Here's how the story was sold to the public. On March 12, the Gerald at Ford carrier strike group was operating in international waters off Venezuela's northern coast, conducting what the Pentagon called routine operations to uphold freedom of navigation. Around 1,400 hours local time, 2 Venezuelan Guaycamacuto-class patrol boats, small, fast vessels armed with machine guns and anti-ship missiles, approached the carrier group at high speed. The U.S. Navy claims the Venezuelans came within 500 yards of the Ford's escorts, a distance considered unsafe and unprofessional under international maritime law. The U.S. responded with a series of escalatory first, radio warnings, then, flares and warning shots from the destroyer USS Mason. Finally, the Venezuelans broke off. No shots were fired in anger. No casualties. Just another day in the life of the world's most powerful navy, right? The media ran with it. CNN called it a dangerous provocation. Fox News framed it as Maduro testing Biden. The State Department issued a statement condemning Venezuela's reckless behavior, and the Pentagon assured the public that the Ford would continue its operations as planned. Case closed. But there's a problem with this narrative. First, the timing. Why now? The Gerald at Ford had been in the region for weeks, conducting joint exercises with Colombia and the Dominican Republic. Venezuela had known it was there. So why pick this moment to make a move? Second, the Venezuelan response. Nicolas Maduro's regime is many things: corrupt, authoritarian, economically desperate, but it's not suicidal. Venezuela's navy is a shadow of what it was in the 1980s. Its most capable ships are rusting in port. Its air force can barely keep its MiG-29s in the air. So why risk a direct confrontation with the most powerful carrier strike group in history? And third, the U.S. reaction. The Ford didn't just happen to be in the Caribbean. It was there because of Venezuela. Because of China. Because of Russia. This wasn't routine. It was a message. So what's really going on? Deconstructing the hidden facts. Let's start with the most obvious: why would Venezuela provoke the U.S. now? The answer isn't just because Maduro is a thug. It's because Venezuela is desperate, and desperation makes regimes do reckless things. But here's the part they're not telling: Venezuela didn't act alone. In the weeks leading up to the incident, there was a flurry of activity in Caracas. Russian military advisors, part of the Wagner Group's successor, Africa Corps, were spotted at Venezuelan naval bases. Chinese intelligence officers were reportedly in the country, coordinating with Maduro's security services. And just days before the Ford incident, a Venezuelan delegation quietly visited Beijing, where they secured a new $5 billion line of credit despite U.S. sanctions. Now, let's look at the Ford's movements. The carrier didn't just stumble into Venezuelan waters. It was part of a carefully choreographed show of force. The Ford had just completed joint exercises with Colombia, a country that, not coincidentally, has been in a border dispute with Venezuela for years. The US was sending a "we're back in Latin America, and we're not leaving." But here's where it gets interesting. The Venezuelan patrol boats didn't just approach the fort at random. They came from a specific the Golfo Triste, a body of water near Venezuela's largest oil refinery, El Palito. That refinery has been a target of US sanctions for years, but here's the kicker: it's also where China has been investing heavily in recent months. In other words, this wasn't just a naval provocation. It was a resource provocation. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia. And China, facing energy shortages and US pressure on its Middle Eastern suppliers, has been quietly extending its footprint in Venezuela. The fort's presence wasn't just about freedom of navigation. It was about cutting off China's access to Venezuelan oil. And that's when the Russians got involved. You see, Russia has a vested interest in keeping Venezuela afloat. Not out of any love for Maduro, but because a US victory in Venezuela would mean a US victory in its own backyard. If the US can topple Maduro, what's to stop it from doing the same in Cuba, Nicaragua, or even Bolivia? So Russia has been arming Venezuela, training its military, and most importantly, providing intelligence support. Here's the smoking: US intelligence sources tell me that the Venezuelan patrol boats were guided by Russian electronic warfare systems. The same systems that Russia has used in Syria and Ukraine to jam NATO communications. The same systems that allowed the Venezuelans to approach the fort undetected until the last moment. So Venezuela, backed by Russia and China, provokes the US near a critical oil refinery. The US responds with a show of force, but doesn't escalate. China gets a "we can cut off your oil supply whenever we want." Russia gets a "we see what you're doing, and we're not backing down." This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated escalation in a much larger game. The exited geopolitical, the new Cold War in Latin America. Now, let's out. Because this incident isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of American hegemony in our own hemisphere. For decades, the US treated Latin America as its de facto sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was an assumption. But that assumption is collapsing. And the reason is China and Russia are filling the void. Let's start with China. Over the last decade, Beijing has poured hundreds of billions of dollars into Latin America: loans, infrastructure projects, military aid. It's not doing this out of altruism. It's doing it because Latin America is the last untapped frontier for Chinese action. The region has oil, copper, lithium, and most importantly, a population of 650 million people who are increasingly disillusioned with the US. And then there's Russia. Moscow doesn't have China's economic clout, but it has something just as leverage. Russia has been arming Venezuela, training its military, and most crucially, providing it with the tools to resist US pressure. When the US sanctioned Venezuela's oil industry, Russia stepped in with tankers, refining technology, and even cybersecurity support to help Maduro evade sanctions. Now, here's where it gets dangerous. The US has spent the last 30 years acting like it can maintain a unipolar world where it sets the rules, and everyone else follows. But that world is gone. We're now in a multipolar system, where China, Russia, and even regional powers like Iran and Turkey are carving out their own spheres of influence. And Latin America is the front line. The Ford incident wasn't just a naval standoff. It was a proxy conflict between the US and its rivals. China wants Venezuela's oil. Russia wants to keep the US distracted. And the US? It wants to reassert dominance in a region it's taken for granted for too long. But here's the US is playing a losing game. Why? Because the rules have changed. In the 20th century, the US could invade AMA or Grenada and face no real consequences. Today, if the US tries to topple Maduro, China will retaliate economically. Russia will escalate in Ukraine or the Middle East. And the rest of Latin America, countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, will see the US as a bully, not a partner. This is the new Cold War. And the US is losing it. Military and strategic, the illusion of overwhelming force. Now, let's talk about the military side of this. Because the Ford incident reveals something deeply troubling about US. We still think we can solve everything with carriers and bombs. The Gerald R. Ford is the most advanced warship in history. It carries 75 aircraft, including F-35C stealth fighters. It has electromagnetic catapults, advanced radar, and enough firepower to level a small country. And yet, when two small patrol boats approached it, the US had to fire warning shots to get them to back off. Think about that. The most powerful navy in the world was challenged by two boats that, in a real war, would be sunk in minutes. But in this case, they weren't sunk. Because this wasn't a war. It was a test. And the test revealed something: the US is not prepared for the kind of war it's about to face. Let me explain. For the last 20 years, the US military has been optimized for counterinsurgency, fighting terrorists in the desert, not great powers in the Caribbean. Our carriers are designed to project power against weak states, not to survive in a contested environment. And our doctrine assumes that no one will dare challenge us in our own hemisphere. But that assumption is dead. China has been building anti-ship ballistic missiles, carrier killers, for years. Russia has been deploying hypersonic missiles that can strike anywhere in the world in minutes. And both countries have been perfecting electronic warfare techniques that can blind our sensors and jam our communications. In other words, the Ford might be the most advanced carrier ever built, but in a real war, it would be a sitting duck. And that's the real lesson of the Venezuela incident. The US can send a carrier to intimidate Maduro, but if China or Russia decide to escalate, we don't have a good answer. We can't just bomb Caracas into submission, not without risking a wider war. And we can't rely on sanctions alone, because China and Russia will just step in to fill the gap. So what's the alternative? Diplomacy. But that's a dirty word in Washington these days. The domestic political why this is about more than Venezuela. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the American politics. Because this incident wasn't just about geopolitics. It was about elections. The Biden administration is in a tough spot. Inflation is still high. The border crisis is out of control. And the American people are tired of foreign wars. So when Venezuela provokes the US, the White House has to respond forcefully or do nothing. This is where the Ford incident gets really interesting. Because the White House didn't just respond with a show of force. It leaked the incident to the media. It held press briefings. It made sure the world knew that the US had stood up to Maduro. Why? Because 2024 is an election year. And nothing plays better with voters than a strong man being put in his place. But here's this isn't about strength. It's about desperation. The US is trying to reassert dominance in Latin America because it's losing influence everywhere else. In the Middle East, China brokered a Saudi-Iran deal. In Africa, Russia is extending its footprint in Asia. China is building military bases in the South China Sea. So the White House is overcompensating. It's sending carriers to Venezuela. It's arming Taiwan. It's sanctioning half the world. But none of this is working, because the US is fighting a symptom, not the disease. The disease is American decline. And no amount of carrier deployments can stop it. Scenario: what happens next? So where does this go from here? Let's look at three possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case, a frozen conflict. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela reach a tacit understanding. The Ford leaves the region. Venezuela stops provoking US ships. And both sides agree to a modus vivendi, a temporary truce where neither side pushes too hard. This is the most likely outcome in the short term. But it's not stable. Because China and Russia won't stop pushing. They'll keep arming Venezuela. They'll keep investing in the region. And eventually, the US will have to respond either with more sanctions, more military deployments, or both. Scenario 2, the most likely case, escalation without war. In this scenario, the US doubles down. It imposes new sanctions on Venezuela. It arms Colombia and Guyana. It conducts more naval exercises in the Caribbean. Venezuela, backed by Russia and China, responds by seizing U.S. assets in the country. Oil shipments to China increase. And the region becomes a de facto battleground between the U.S. and its rivals. This is the most dangerous scenario, because it creates a permanent state of tension. The U.S. will be drawn into a series of proxy conflicts, draining resources and attention from more critical theaters like Asia. And eventually, something will go wrong, a miscalculation, an accident, a rogue commander, and the situation will spiral out of control. Scenario 3, the worst case, direct confrontation. In this scenario, the U.S. decides to go all in. It imposes a full naval blockade on Venezuela. It arms opposition groups. It even considers a limited military strike. Venezuela, backed by Russia and China, responds by attacking U.S. assets in the region. Russia sends advisors to Venezuela. China threatens to cut off rare earth exports to the U.S. And suddenly, the world is on the brink of a real war. This is the least likely scenario, but it's not impossible. Because once the U.S. starts down the path of escalation, it's hard to stop. And in a multipolar world, every conflict has the potential to go global. Grand strategy: the folly of liberal hegemony. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. Because the Ford incident isn't just a failure of policy. It's a failure of strategy. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has pursued a grand strategy known as liberal hegemony, the idea that the U.S. should use its military and economic power to spread democracy, free markets, and American values around the world. This strategy has led to endless wars, trillions of dollars in debt, and a global backlash against American power. And it's not working. The U.S. tried to spread democracy in Iraq, it got a failed state. It tried to spread democracy in Libya, it got a civil war. It tried to spread democracy in Afghanistan, it got the Taliban back in power. And now, it's trying to spread democracy in Venezuela, with predictable results. The problem isn't that the U.S. is evil. The problem is that empires don't last forever. The British Empire collapsed. The Soviet Union collapsed. And the American Empire is next, unless we change course. So what's the alternative? Realism. A realist foreign policy would accept that the world is multipolar. It would recognize that the U.S. can't be the world's policeman. And it would focus on core interests, protecting the homeland, securing trade routes, and preventing any single power from dominating Eurasia. In Latin America, that means containment, not regime change. It means working with regional powers like Brazil and Mexico to counterbalance China and Russia. And it means accepting that Venezuela is a problem, not an existential threat. But that's not what Washington wants to hear. Because Washington is addicted to power. And power, like any addiction, is hard to give up. Alternatives and what the U.S. should do instead. So what should the U.S. do? Here's my 1. Stop the provocations. The U.S. doesn't need to send carriers to Venezuela to prove it's strong. It just needs to stop acting like a bully. Every time the U.S. conducts a freedom of navigation operation near Venezuela, it gives Maduro a propaganda victory. Every time it imposes new sanctions, it pushes Venezuela closer to China and Russia. 2. Engage in diplomacy. The U.S. should open back-channel talks with Venezuela. Not to lift sanctions immediately, but to de-escalate. Offer Maduro a way out, sanctions relief in exchange for free elections, or at least a reduction in Russian and Chinese influence. This one. Here's the uncomfortable truth: Maduro isn't the only one who benefits from this standoff. The U.S. foreign policy establishment thrives on it too. Every time a carrier strike group sails near Venezuela, defense contractors see dollar signs. Every time the Pentagon warns of Russian or Chinese influence in the region, think tanks in Washington secure more funding. And every time the media breathlessly reports on Venezuela's aggression, the narrative of American indispensability gets another boost. It's a self-sustaining cycle, and no one in power has an incentive to break it. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader contest for influence in Latin America, a region that Washington has treated as its backyard for over a century. The Monroe Doctrine isn't dead, it's just been rebranded. Today, it's called countering malign influence, but the logic is the no outside powers allowed. The problem is, China and Russia don't see it that way. And neither do many Latin American leaders. Take Brazil, for example. Under Lula, Brazil has pursued a foreign policy that's increasingly independent of Washington. In 2023, Lula refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, instead calling for a negotiated peace. He's also deepened ties with China, signing a currency swap deal to reduce reliance on the dollar. And he's been vocal about the need for Latin America to chart its own course. This isn't anti-Americanism, it's pragmatism. Brazil sees the US as a declining hegemon and is hedging its bets. Mexico is another case in which President López Obrador has maintained a careful balancing act, cooperating with the US on migration and security while also strengthening economic ties with China. In 2022, Mexico became China's second-largest trading partner in Latin America, after Brazil. And let's not forget that Mexico has refused to join US sanctions against Russia, instead calling for dialogue. This isn't because López Obrador is a Russian puppet, it's because Mexico knows that alienating China or Russia would be economic suicide. Here's why this matters. The US can no longer assume that Latin America will automatically follow its lead. The region is diversifying its partnerships, and Washington's heavy-handed approach is only accelerating that trend. Every time the US imposes sanctions on Venezuela, it pushes Caracas closer to Beijing and Moscow. Every time it threatens military action, it gives regional leaders another reason to seek alternatives to US dominance. Let me explain the military implications. The USS Gerald Ford incident wasn't just a blip, it was a warning. Venezuela's military has been modernizing with Russian and Chinese help. In 2021, Venezuela received a shipment of Russian S-300 air defense systems, which could pose a serious threat to US aircraft in the region. It's also acquired Chinese radar systems and drones, which give it better situational awareness. And let's not forget the Iranian influence. Venezuela has received Iranian-made missiles and drones, which could be used to target US assets in the Caribbean. Now, I'm not saying Venezuela is a military match for the US. It's not. But that's not the point is that the US can no longer operate in Latin America with impunity. Every time it sends a carrier strike group near Venezuela, it risks a miscalculation that could escalate into a broader conflict. And in a multipolar world, that's a risk the US can't afford to take. So what's the alternative? It's not isolationism, it's strategic restraint. The US needs to accept that it can't control every country in its hemisphere. It needs to stop treating Latin America as a chessboard and start treating it as a collection of sovereign nations with their own interests. And it needs to recognize that China and Russia aren't going anywhere. The question isn't how to keep them out, it's how to manage their influence without triggering a new Cold War. Here's how the US can do that. First, it needs to stop treating Latin America as a monolith. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina all have different interests and priorities. The US should work with each country individually, not through a one-size-fits-all approach. Second, it needs to offer real incentives for cooperation, not just threats. That means trade deals, investment, and development assistance, not just sanctions and military posturing. And third, it needs to accept that some countries will have relationships with China and Russia, and that's okay. The goal shouldn't be to cut them off, it should be to ensure that those relationships don't threaten US interests. Let's take Venezuela as a case study. The US should offer Maduro a way out, but not the way it's done before. No more regime change light, where the US demands elections but refuses to lift sanctions until the opposition wins. That's not diplomacy, that's coercion. Instead, the US should offer a phased lifting of sanctions in exchange for the release of political prisoners, the reopening of opposition media, and a commitment to free and fair elections. It should also offer economic assistance to help Venezuela rebuild its oil industry, which has been crippled by years of mismanagement and sanctions. But here's the catch, this can't be a one-way street. The US needs to be willing to make concessions too. That means accepting that Maduro might not be ousted, at least not immediately. It means recognizing that Venezuela will likely maintain ties with Russia and China, even if it reduces its dependence on them. And it means accepting that the US can't dictate Venezuela's future, it can only influence it. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. But Maduro is a dictator. We can't just let him get away with this. And you're right, Maduro is a dictator. But the US has a long history of supporting dictators when it suits its interests. It backed Pinochet in Chile, the Shah in Iran, and the Saudis in the Middle East. The difference is that those dictatorships were useful to the US. Venezuela isn't. So the question isn't whether Maduro is a bad guy, it's whether the US has a better option than endless confrontation. The answer is yes. The US can contain Venezuela without trying to overthrow it. It can work with regional partners to limit Russian and Chinese influence without starting a war. And it can focus on its core interests, protecting the homeland, securing trade routes, and preventing any single power from dominating the hemisphere without trying to micromanage every country in Latin America. But that requires something that Washington has: humility. The US can't be the world's policeman anymore. It can't afford to be. The era of unipolarity is over, and the sooner the US accepts that, the better off it and the world will be. The alternative is more incidents like the USS Gerald are afford, more standoffs, more brinkmanship, and eventually, more war. And that's a future none of us can afford. Now, what most people don't realize is that this entire episode, the near clash with the Gerald are afford, the sanctions, the saber rattling, isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of a domestic political consensus in the United States that has held since the end of the Cold War. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that it could shape Latin America in its image either through soft power, economic coercion, or, when necessary, the blunt force of regime change. But that consensus is fracturing, and the Venezuela crisis is exposing the fault lines in real time. Let me explain why this matters. On one side, you have the traditional foreign policy establishment, think the State Department's Latin America desk, the remnants of the Bush-era neoconservatives, and a significant chunk of the Democratic Party's hawkish wing. They still believe in the old sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the occasional covert operation to force a change in Caracas. Their argument is Maduro is a threat to regional stability, a Russian and Chinese proxy, and a human rights abuser. Leaving him in power, they say, would be a moral and strategic failure. On the other side, you have a growing coalition of realists, libertarians, and progressive Democrats who are questioning whether this approach has ever worked. They point to the fact that after 2 decades of U.S. pressure, from the 2002 coup attempt against Chavez to the 2019 recognition of Juan Guaidó as interim president, Maduro is still in power, Venezuela's economy is in shambles, and the country is more dependent on Russia and China than ever. The sanctions, they argue, have only deepened the suffering of ordinary Venezuelans while enriching the regime's inner circle through black market oil sales and corruption. Here's the uncomfortable: both sides are right, and both are wrong. The hawks are correct that Maduro is a problem, but they're delusional if they think more pressure will magically produce a democratic transition. The realists are right that the current policy has failed, but they're naive if they think the US can simply walk away without consequences. The question isn't whether to engage or disengage, it's how to engage in a way that actually serves US interests without making the situation worse. And that's where the domestic politics get messy. Because the Venezuela issue isn't just about foreign policy, it's about identity, ideology, and the future of American power. For the right, Venezuela is a symbol of everything they: socialism, anti-Americanism, and the decline of US influence. For the left, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of interventionism and the hypocrisy of US foreign policy. Neither side is particularly interested in nuance. They'd rather score political points than solve the problem. Take the 2020 election, for example. Trump's Venezuela policy was a masterclass in performative toughness. He imposed crippling sanctions, recognized Guaidó, and even flirted with the idea of a military intervention. But none of it worked. Maduro didn't fall, the opposition fractured, and Venezuela's oil production continued to plummet. Meanwhile, Biden came into office promising a more humane approach, but in practice, he's largely continued Trump's policy, albeit with less bluster. The result? More of the same. Now, with the 2024 election looming, Venezuela is becoming a political football again. The Republicans are already framing Biden as weak on Maduro, pointing to the recent prisoner swap and the easing of some sanctions as proof that the administration is coddling dictators. The Democrats, meanwhile, are trying to thread the needle, maintaining pressure on Maduro while avoiding another failed regime change gambit. Neither side has a coherent strategy, because neither side is willing to admit that the old playbook is broken. So what happens next? Let's game out a few scenarios. First, there's the status quo. The US keeps sanctions in place, Maduro stays in power, and Venezuela remains a failed state on America's doorstep. This is the most likely outcome, because it requires the least effort from Washington. The problem is that it's unsustainable. Venezuela's collapse is already spilling over into Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The migrant crisis is straining US border resources, and the longer Maduro stays in power, the more entrenched his regime becomes. Russia and China, meanwhile, will continue to deepen their influence, using Venezuela as a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Second, there's the grand bargain scenario. The US offers Maduro a sanctions relief in exchange for free elections, the release of political prisoners, and a commitment to reduce ties with Russia and China. This is the approach I outlined earlier, and it's the one that makes the most sense. But it's also the hardest to sell politically. The hawks will scream betrayal, and Maduro will have to make real concessions, which he's historically been unwilling to do. Still, it's not impossible. After all, the US has cut deals with far worse actors. Just look at the Iran nuclear agreement or the normalization of relations with Cuba. Third, there's the escalation scenario. If Maduro continues to test US resolve, whether by harassing US ships, deepening ties with Russia, or cracking down on the opposition, Washington could decide to double down. This could mean more sanctions, covert operations, or even a limited military strike. The problem is that none of these options are likely to work. More sanctions will only hurt ordinary Venezuelans. Covert operations have a poor track record in Latin America. And a military strike would be a disaster, both politically and strategically. It would unite the region against the US, give Maduro a propaganda victory, and risk a wider conflict. Finally, there's the wildcard: a sudden collapse of the Maduro regime. This could happen if the military turns on him, if the economy implodes, or if Russia and China decide he's more trouble than he's worth. But even in this scenario, the US would have to be careful. A power vacuum in Venezuela could lead to chaos, or worse, a more radical government taking over. The last thing the US wants is another Cuba, or worse, another Syria. So where does that leave us? The most realistic path forward is a mix of containment and engagement. The US should maintain enough pressure to keep Maduro in check, but it should also be willing to negotiate. That means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon, but it also means making it clear that there are consequences for his actions. If he harasses US ships, the US should respond with targeted sanctions on his inner circle. If he holds free elections, the US should offer sanctions relief. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than the alternatives. The bigger question, though, is whether Washington is capable of this kind of nuanced approach. The US foreign policy establishment has a long history of all-or-nothing thinking. It's either regime change or appeasement, engagement or isolation. The idea that the US might have to live with an imperfect outcome, that it might have to accept Maduro's continued rule while working to limit his worst excesses, is anathema to many in Washington. But that's exactly what the US did during the Cold War. It coexisted with dictators, cut deals with adversaries, and focused on its core interests. The difference is that back then, the US had a clear strategy. Today, it's flying blind. And that's the real lesson of the Gerald R. Ford incident. It's not just about Venezuela. It's about the fact that the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. It's about the fact that the old rules don't apply anymore. And it's about the fact that if the US doesn't adapt, it's going to keep stumbling into crises it can't control. The question is whether Washington is willing to learn. Because if it isn't, the next incident won't be a near miss. It'll be a disaster. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader unraveling of US strategic discipline in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that Latin America was its backyard, a region where it could dictate terms with minimal resistance. That assumption is now dead, and the Gerald R. Ford incident was its funeral. The problem isn't that Maduro is a particularly brilliant strategist, he's not. The problem is that the US has spent the last 2 decades reacting to crises rather than shaping the environment to prevent them. And when you're always reacting, you're always one step behind. Let me explain why this matters. The US has 2 fundamental options in Venezuela, and neither of them is particularly appealing. The first is the status a mix of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and occasional saber-rattling. This approach has been in place since the Obama administration, and it hasn't worked. Maduro is still in power, the economy is still a basket case, and the country is still a haven for Russian and Iranian influence. The second option is regime change, which would require either a military intervention or a sustained campaign to destabilize the government. The former is politically impossible. No American president is going to invade Venezuela after Iraq and Afghanistan, and the latter is a gamble that could easily backfire. Look at what happened in Libya after Gaddafi fell. The country descended into chaos, and the power vacuum was filled by militias, jihadists, and foreign powers. Venezuela is not Libya, but the principle removing a dictator doesn't guarantee stability, and it certainly doesn't guarantee a pro-American government. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is stuck with Maduro, at least for the foreseeable future. The question is whether Washington can accept that reality and adapt its strategy accordingly. The Cold War offers a useful template. During the 1970s and 1980s, the US coexisted with a range of unsavory regimes, from Pinochet in Chile to the military junta in Argentina, because it understood that the alternative was worse. It didn't mean the US liked these governments, but it recognized that its core interests, containing Soviet influence, maintaining regional stability, and protecting access to resources, were best served by a pragmatic approach. The key was the US knew what it wanted, and it was willing to cut deals with adversaries to get it. Today, the US lacks that clarity. Its Venezuela policy is a mess of contradictions. On one hand, it imposes crippling sanctions that hurt ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime. On the other, it occasionally hints at negotiations, only to pull back when domestic politics intervene. The result is a policy that satisfies no one and achieves nothing. The Biden administration's recent decision to ease some sanctions in exchange for electoral concessions was a step in the right direction, but it was quickly undermined by congressional Republicans and hardliners in the State Department. That's the problem with all or nothing: it leaves no room for compromise, even when compromise is the only way forward. So what should the US do? First, it needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere. That doesn't mean the US has to recognize his government or lift all sanctions, but it does mean acknowledging that regime change is off the table for now. Second, it needs to refocus its efforts on containing Venezuela's worst impulses. That means working with regional allies, Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, to isolate Maduro diplomatically and economically. It means cracking down on Russian and Iranian influence in the country, not through military action, but through intelligence sharing and targeted sanctions. And it means offering a clear path to sanctions relief if Maduro takes concrete steps toward reform, like releasing political prisoners or allowing free elections. Third, and most importantly, the US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a domestic political issue. For too long, Venezuela policy has been driven by the whims of Florida's Cuban-American lobby and the ideological preferences of whichever party is in power. That's no way to run a foreign policy. The US needs a bipartisan consensus on Venezuela, one that prioritizes stability over regime change and pragmatism over ideology. That won't be easy. Foreign policy is more polarized than ever, but it's necessary. The alternative is a policy that lurches from crisis to crisis, with no clear endgame in sight. The Gerald R. Ford incident was a wake-up call. It showed that the US can no longer take its dominance in the Western Hemisphere for granted. But it also showed that the US has options if it's willing to think strategically. The question is whether Washington has the discipline to do so. History suggests it doesn't, but history isn't destiny. The US has reinvented its foreign policy before, from the isolationism of the 1930s to the containment strategy of the Cold War. It can do so again. The only question is whether it will. And if it doesn't, the next crisis won't be a near miss. It'll be a disaster.